There's a new study that was recently published in the journal Nature, which produced comprehensive, high-fidelity maps of the world's land-based and aquatic habitats. These high-resolution maps offered a powerful insight into the extent of human activity and its impact on the remaining wild areas of the planet. After extensive research and mapping, their conclusion was that less than 23% of the planet's landmass is still wilderness. And this doesn't even mean completely untouched wilderness, as these wild areas still host rural communities that often support themselves through an ecologically sensitive subsistence lifestyle. Wilderness was defined as an area where there isn't industrial-level activity, like urbanization, extensive paving, literal industry, that kind of stuff. James Watson, researcher at the University of Queensland, was the lead author of the paper. He said, quote, "These results are nothing short of a horror story for the planet's last wild places. The loss of wilderness must be treated in the same way we treat extinction. There is no reversing once the first cut enters. The decision is forever." Unquote. By the first cut, I presume he's talking about the first plant that you cut down, or the first tree you cut down, as part of a logging operation or a land clearing operation. It never stops. Once you start, the economic incentive just pushes you to keep going. And it's really, really hard to get people collectively to stop and preserve some of these wild areas, to stop and preserve nature and appreciate it for what it is. There was also a co-author of the paper, Kendall Jones, who's a conservation planning specialist, who was also quoted as saying, "Wilderness areas are strongholds for biodiversity that is declining almost everywhere else, such as endangered species like tigers and rhinoceros. In the ocean, they're the last places you still find healthy populations of top predators, like sharks and tuna." Unquote. These wilderness areas are extremely valuable, and the fact that they're rapidly shrinking and fragmenting is disastrous. From a human perspective, these undeveloped wild places are homes to indigenous communities who subsist on the biodiversity around them. In other, slightly more developed countries, these wild areas might have more developed rural communities that don't necessarily live on a subsistence lifestyle. Maybe they get food delivered by truck, but they still have all of this wilderness around them. It's relatively pristine, and so it can still be called a wild area or untouched wilderness. However, as all of these wilderness areas are shrinking and being destroyed, these indigenous communities are losing their ability to support themselves. They're losing their way of life, and their distinct cultures are dissolving. From an ecological perspective, animal populations are fleeing human development, and they're taking refuge in these wild areas. But as we continue to build roads and power lines and stuff like this, these habitats continue to fragment, and they become even less supportive of the animal inhabitants. From insects to birds to megafauna, population sizes are plummeting. Biodiversity is plummeting. Predators are particularly vulnerable, because they need a very large hunting ground and large prey populations to sustain themselves. But when you have increasingly fragmented habitats and dwindling prey populations, the population numbers of predators are collapsing. And when an ecosystem loses its predators, it falls out of balance and can get destroyed, as unregulated prey populations eat all of the vegetation and strip the land bare. And on that note, from a global perspective, these wilderness areas are also the last areas with dense forest and very heavy vegetation. These are the last terrestrial, biological carbon sinks, and the more these regions are plundered and developed, the less and less effective they are at sequestering carbon. The forests aren't as extensive, they don't spread out as wide, and they aren't as dense. And this feeds into the greater issue of climate change, where we need to reduce our carbon emissions so as to avoid climate catastrophe. And running parallel to this, we also need to increase our capacity for carbon sequestration. This would include protecting what forests we have left, and trying to grow forests wherever we can, so that thousands and millions of tons of carbon in the atmosphere can instead be incorporated into biomass. In light of these results, it's not surprising that the researchers strongly advocate for changes to international policy to really kick wilderness conservation efforts into high gear for the sake of our species and for every other species that we share this planet with. John Robinson is another co-author of the paper, as well as the executive vice president for global conservation at the Wildlife Conservation Society. And he said, quote, "Wilderness will only be secured globally if these nations take a leadership role. Right now, across the board, this type of leadership is missing. Already, we have lost so much. We must grasp these opportunities to secure the wilderness before it disappears forever." Unquote.